October 12, 1944, waters east of Formosa. Lieutenant Commander Kaneyoshi Kusaka gripped the edges of the navigation table aboard the light carrier Chitose, his knuckles white against the charted Pacific. Through the carrier's bridge windows, he watched a single Essex-class carrier steam on the horizon, its massive flight deck alive with activity. Planes launched and recovered in an endless cycle that seemed to mock everything he had been taught about carrier operations. In the 40 minutes Kusaka had been watching, he counted 63 aircraft operations, launches and recoveries, more sorties than his entire air group could mount in a full day. The air officer beside him whispered what they were both thinking. That is not possible. One carrier cannot sustain that tempo. But it was possible. And it was happening. What Kusaka witnessed that morning represented more than impressive seamanship. It was the visible manifestation of an industrial and tactical revolution that had already decided the Pacific War, though Japanese commanders refused to accept it. A single American fleet carrier now deployed more operational aircraft than many Japanese carriers possessed in total. The psychological impact of this realization would ripple through the Imperial Japanese Navy's remaining carrier pilots, transforming confident warriors into men who stopped writing letters home because they could no longer pretend hope existed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of how one Essex carrier came to eclipse Japan's entire naval aviation capability begins not in 1944, but in the design bureaus of 1939 and the production lines of 1942, when American naval architects began planning what would become the Essex-class. They were designing for a war they hoped to avoid but increasingly expected to fight. The specifications reflected lessons learned from earlier carriers and anticipation of air warfare's growing importance. The contract for the first Essex-class carrier was awarded in July 1940. The keel of USS Essex herself was laid at Newport News Shipbuilding on April 28, 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor. The ship was launched on July 31, 1942, and commissioned on December 31, 1942, 20 months from keel laying to commissioning, a pace that would have seemed impossible to Japanese shipyards. The Essex-class measured 872 feet in length overall, with a beam of 93 feet at the waterline, though the flight deck extended to 147 feet. The ships displaced 27,500 tons standard, 36,600 tons fully loaded. 4 sets of Westinghouse-geared turbines drove the vessels to 33 knots maximum speed. The flight deck measured 862 feet by 108 feet, providing ample room for simultaneous launch and recovery operations. But the true revolution lay not in the ship's size, impressive though it was, but in its air group capacity and operational systems. An Essex carrier was designed to operate an air group of 90 to 100 aircraft, though wartime loadings often varied. More critically, the ships incorporated innovations that allowed them to launch and recover aircraft at rates Japanese carriers could not match. The hangar deck on an Essex measured 554 feet long by 70 feet wide, with a clear height of 17.5 feet. 3 aircraft elevators, 2 deck edge and 1 centerline, moved planes between hangar and flight deck. Each elevator could lift a 14,000-pound aircraft from hangar to flight deck in 15 seconds. This seemingly minor specification had enormous operational consequences. Japanese carriers typically used slower elevators, often requiring 30 to 40 seconds for the same movement. Across hundreds of daily operations, this difference translated to entire additional strike packages. An Essex could launch a full deckload of aircraft, strike an enemy hundreds of miles away, recover them, rearm and refuel below decks, and launch again, all while Japanese carriers were still cycling through their first recovery. The machinery of flight operations aboard an Essex reflected systematic American engineering. The ship carried over 400,000 gallons of aviation gasoline, stored in armored tanks below the waterline. Sophisticated pumping systems delivered fuel to multiple fueling stations on the hangar and flight decks simultaneously. Ammunition magazines stored hundreds of tons of bombs, torpedoes, and machine gun ammunition, in compartments isolated by fire doors and sprinkler systems. 8 bomb and torpedo elevators moved ordnance from the magazines to the hangar and flight decks. Arresting gear capable of stopping a 20,000-pound aircraft landing at 90 miles per hour lined the flight deck. Multiple sets of gear meant that if one installation was damaged, others could continue operations. The ship mounted 2 hydraulic catapults capable of launching aircraft too heavy to take off under their own power from the deck length available. For Japanese pilots accustomed to their own carriers, watching an Essex in operation induced cognitive dissonance. Japanese fleet carriers like Shokaku or Zuikaku were formidable warships, displacing 25,000 tons and operating air groups of 70 to 75 aircraft. But Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized striking first and striking hard with a massive alpha strike. Recovery, rearming, and follow-up strikes were slower, more deliberate processes. American carrier doctrine, evolving rapidly through combat experience, emphasized sustained operations. The goal was not one devastating blow, but continuous pressure, multiple strikes per day, maintaining aircraft over the target area for hours. Essex carriers were engineered to sustain this operational tempo. Every system, from elevators to ammunition handling to repair facilities, was designed for endurance. The air groups aboard Essex carriers reflected this philosophy. By late 1944, a typical Essex air group consisted of approximately 36 Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters, 36 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, or Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, and 18 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. The exact composition varied by mission and availability, but the pattern was consistent. Large fighter complements for air superiority, substantial dive bomber strength for precision strikes, and torpedo bombers for anti-ship operations. What shocked Japanese observers was not just the number of aircraft, but their quality and the skill of their crews. The F-6F Hellcat, introduced in mid-1943, was specifically designed to defeat the Mitsubishi A6M0. It was faster, more heavily armed, better protected, and could outdive and outclimb the Zero at most altitudes. American pilots, trained in tactics that emphasized teamwork and energy fighting rather than individual dogfighting, achieved kill ratios approaching 20-1 against Japanese aircraft. The Hellcat's performance specifications told the story. Powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower, the Hellcat reached 380 miles per hour at 17,300 feet. It climbed at 3,500 feet per minute initially and possessed a combat radius of over 450 miles. Armament consisted of 650 caliber machine guns with 400 rounds per gun. Later versions mounted 2 20mm cannons in addition to 450s. Most importantly, the Hellcat was rugged. It could absorb battle damage that would destroy lighter fighters and still bring its pilot home. Armor plate protected the pilot from behind. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires from small-caliber hits. The R2800 engine was one of the most reliable aircraft engines ever built, able to run with cylinders shot out. For Japanese pilots flying increasingly worn Zeros with dwindling fuel and ammunition, engaging Hellcats was suicide. The Americans could dictate engagement terms. If a Zero tried to turn fight, Hellcats could disengage, climb away, then boom and zoom from above. If Zeros ran, Hellcats could chase them down. American pilots described combat as target practice. Japanese pilots who survived described helpless terror. The dive bombers aboard Essex carriers also outclassed their Japanese equivalents. The SB-2C Helldiver, despite initial mechanical problems, evolved into a potent strike aircraft. It could carry a 2,000-pound bomb or a torpedo, possessed self-sealing tanks and armor, and mounted defensive armament sufficient to deter attackers. The TBF Avenger torpedo bomber was even more formidable, a 3-seat aircraft that could deliver a torpedo or 2,000 pounds of bombs and bristled with 50 caliber machine guns. By contrast, Japanese carrier attack aircraft by 1944 were increasingly obsolete. The The Nakajima B-6N torpedo bomber and Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber were faster than their predecessors, but lacked armor, self-sealing tanks, and adequate defensive armament. They were death traps. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, American fighters destroyed them in such numbers that American pilots called the engagement the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But for Japanese pilots, what induced despair was not just individual aircraft quality, it was the system. When Kusaka watched that Essex carrier conduct 63 flight operations in 40 minutes, he was witnessing the culmination of American systems engineering applied to naval aviation. Consider the simple act of launching a strike. On a Japanese carrier, aircraft were brought up from the hangar deck one at a time, spotted on the flight deck, armed, fueled, and started. The process took 1 to 2 hours for a full deck strike of 30 to 40 aircraft. On an Essex, elevators brought aircraft up in groups. Arming and fueling occurred simultaneously at multiple stations. Plane handlers spotted aircraft with choreographed precision. An Essex could launch 36 aircraft in under 20 minutes. The recovery process showed even starker differences. Japanese carriers typically recovered aircraft one at a time, each plane landing, catching an arresting wire, being pulled clear by deck crews, then the next aircraft landing. An Essex used multiple arresting wires and had deck crews that could strike aircraft below or move them forward in seconds. An Essex could recover an entire strike group of 36 aircraft in under 30 minutes. These operational tempos meant that an Essex could fly 3 or even 4 full strikes in a single day. Japanese carriers struggled to fly too. Over weeks and months, this differential was crushing. An Essex air group could fly more sorties in a month than a Japanese carrier air group could fly in 3 months, assuming the Japanese pilots and aircraft even lasted that long. The logistical tale supporting Essex carriers was equally overwhelming. Each Essex carried approximately 2 weeks of aviation ordnance and fuel for sustained operations. When supplies ran low, fleet oilers and ammunition ships would rendezvous with the task force, transferring thousands of tons of fuel oil, aviation, gasoline, bombs, and torpedoes while underway. Japanese carriers, by 1944, often couldn't sail at all due to fuel shortages. When they did sortie, they rarely had adequate logistical support to sustain extended operations. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By October 1944, when Lieutenant Commander Kusaka watched that Essex carrier operate east of Formosa, the United States Navy had 14 Essex-class carriers in commission. More were completing at American shipyards every few weeks. Japan, by contrast, had approximately 6 operational fleet and light carriers remaining, and most of those had depleted or barely trained air groups. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 demonstrated the impossible arithmetic Japanese naval aviation faced. The Imperial Japanese Navy committed 4 carriers to the battle: Zuikaku, the last surviving Pearl Harbor veteran, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, all light carriers. Together, they embarked approximately 116 aircraft. Many of the pilots were trainees with minimal flight hours. The carriers served primarily as decoys to draw American carriers away from the invasion beaches. Task Force 38, the American fast carrier force, deployed 9 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers. They embarked over 1,000 aircraft, most flown by combat veterans. When American pilots found the Japanese carrier force on October 25, the result was annihilation. All 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. American losses: a few aircraft. But the starkest illustration of the disparity came not in battle, but in routine operations. Intelligence officers aboard American carriers maintained detailed logs of enemy activity. A report from USS Intrepid dated November 11, 1944, noted that during strikes against Japanese airfields in the Philippines, American pilots observed very limited enemy air response. The report clinically noted that even when Japanese aircraft did appear, enemy pilots demonstrated poor tactical awareness and limited combat skill. The report's appendix contained a more revealing datum. During 6 days of operations off the Philippines, Intrepid's air group flew 837 combat sorties. That was more sorties than all operational Japanese carriers in the Pacific flew during the entire month of November 1944. For Japanese pilots, this realization came not as statistics but as lived experience. Petty Officer First Class Takeshi Maeda, a Zero pilot who survived the Battle of Leyte Gulf, was captured after his aircraft ditched near American ships. During interrogation, he made a statement that American intelligence officers found remarkable. "We knew before we launched that we would not return, not because we planned to die for the Emperor, but because we knew your carriers would fill the sky with fighters. We could not count how many aircraft you had. It seemed impossible that one nation could build so many." Maeda's interrogation transcript, declassified in 1977, contained another telling passage. When asked about Japanese carrier operations, Maeda explained, "Our carriers almost never operated together anymore after 1943. Fuel was too scarce. When we did sail, we could launch perhaps 1 strike per day, sometimes not even that. We heard that American carriers launched 4 or 5 strikes daily. We thought this was propaganda until we saw it ourselves. Then we understood we could not win." The propaganda Maeda referenced was real. Japanese military censors allowed no negative war news to reach the home islands. Pilots returning from unsuccessful missions were forbidden from discussing losses. Families of dead pilots were told their sons had died gloriously destroying multiple American ships. The reality that Japanese pilots were being systematically annihilated by an American aerial offensive they could barely touch was carefully hidden. But pilots like Kusaka and Maeda knew the truth. They saw their squadron mates disappear. They watched American combat air patrols orbit overhead for hours, demonstrating fuel reserves and operational endurance Japanese planes couldn't match. They observed American carriers steam arrogantly close to Japanese bases, launching strikes with impunity, recovering aircraft, and launching again as if demonstrating invincibility. One incident from November 1944 illustrates how thoroughly American carriers dominated by this stage of the war. On November 5th, USS Essex, USS Lexington, USS Ticonderoga, and USS Langley launched strikes against Japanese shipping in Manila Bay. The carriers operated only 80 miles offshore, well within range of Japanese land-based aircraft. Over 2 days, the American carriers flew over 500 sorties, sinking multiple ships and destroying dozens of aircraft on the ground. Japanese counterattacks were so feeble that American fighter pilots complained of boredom orbiting on combat air patrol with nothing to intercept. Captain David McCampbell, the commander of Air Group 15 aboard Essex and the Navy's leading ace, shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in a single mission on October 24th. His after-action report, filled with precise tactical details, treated the destruction of nearly a dozen enemy aircraft with professional detachment. Enemy pilots showed poor formation discipline and did not employ mutual support tactics. Engaging them presented no difficulty. For McCampbell, who would end the war with 34 confirmed kills, this was simply another successful mission. For the Japanese pilots he killed, it was apocalypse. The technological specifics reveal why Essex carriers achieved such dominance. Radar systems aboard American carriers could detect incoming aircraft at distances exceeding 100 miles. Fighter direction officers in the carrier's Combat Information Center would vector Hellcats to intercept threats long before they reached the task force. Japanese pilots often found themselves under attack before they even saw American ships. American carriers also possessed superior damage control. Essex-class ships incorporated lessons from earlier carriers, particularly USS Yorktown and Lexington. Compartmentalization was extensive. Fire suppression systems were redundant. Damage control parties trained constantly. When kamikazes struck American carriers, and many did, the results were often damage, casualties, but not sinking. USS Franklin was hit by 2 bombs while operating off Japan on March 19, 1945. The bombs penetrated the flight deck and exploded on the hangar deck, detonating armed and fueled aircraft. Fires raged. Casualties exceeded 800 dead. Yet Franklin survived, limped back to the United States, and was eventually repaired. Japanese carriers hit by equivalent damage typically sank. By early 1945, Japanese naval aviation had effectively ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. The remaining carriers rarely sailed. Fuel was too scarce, trained pilots too few, replacement aircraft too limited. The once proud carrier air groups that had struck Pearl Harbor, ravaged the Indian Ocean, and dominated the Pacific in 1942 were gone, destroyed by attrition they could never replace. America, by contrast, kept building carriers and training pilots. The Essex-class program eventually produced 24 ships. 9 Independence-class light carriers joined them. Over 100 escort carriers operated in both Pacific and Atlantic theaters. American naval aviation reached a strength exceeding 40,000 aircraft by August 1945. Japan possessed perhaps 1,500 operational aircraft total, most reserved for kamikaze attacks. The letters Japanese pilots stopped writing home tell their own story. Censorship records from the Imperial Japanese Navy, examined after the war, show a dramatic decline in mail volume from carrier aviation units, beginning in mid-1944. By early 1945, some squadrons sent almost no personal mail. Officers initially attributed this to operational security concerns, but post-war interviews with survivors revealed a different truth. "What could we write?" former Lieutenant Saburo Sakai explained in a 1952 interview. "We could not tell our families that we flew obsolete aircraft against an enemy who owned the sky. We could not describe watching American carriers operate with such ease while our own ships hid in ports. We could not admit that we launched knowing we would not return, so we stopped writing. Silence was more honest than lies." The mathematics of carrier aviation tell the story more brutally than words. In 1942, Japan operated 10 fleet and light carriers with approximately 650 operational aircraft. The United States Navy had 7 carriers with approximately 500 aircraft. The balance was relatively even, though American aircraft were beginning to show qualitative advantages. By mid-1944, Japan had perhaps 5 operational carriers with fewer than 300 aircraft total, most flown by inadequately trained pilots. The United States Navy operated over 30 fleet and light carriers, with more than 3,000 aircraft flown by combat veterans. The ratio had shifted from rough parity to 10-to-1 American advantage in less than 2 years. By April 1945, the disparity had become absurd. Japan possessed 2 operational carriers, Hosho and Katsuragi, neither of which could safely sail due to fuel shortages and lack of escorts. Their combined air groups totaled perhaps 60 aircraft. The United States Navy operated over 40 fleet and light carriers, with approximately 4,000 embarked aircraft. The ratio was now 60-to-1. A single American carrier task group deployed more naval aviation power than Japan's entire navy. The industrial foundations of this disparity reveal themselves in production statistics. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards launched 24 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and 122 escort carriers. Japan launched 3 fleet carriers, 5 light carriers, and 5 escort carriers during the same period. American shipyards outproduced Japanese yards by a ratio of roughly 15-to-1 in carrier hulls. Aircraft production showed even starker gaps. American factories delivered over 99,000 naval aircraft between 1941 and 1945. Japanese factories produced approximately 30,000 naval aircraft during the same period. The United States built 3 naval aircraft for every 1 Japan produced. Moreover, American aircraft were increasingly sophisticated. Late-war Hellcats and Corsairs vastly outperformed early-war Wildcats. Japanese aircraft, by contrast, showed minimal improvement and often declined in quality as materials shortages forced substitution of inferior components. Pilot training revealed perhaps the most critical disparity. American naval aviators by 1944 typically received over 300 hours of flight training, before joining operational squadrons. This included gunnery training, navigation, carrier landing practice, and tactical instruction. Once in squadrons, pilots participated in intensive workups before deploying to combat. Japanese pilot training had collapsed by late 1943. Fuel shortages limited flight hours. Experienced instructors were pulled from training duty to fill operational squadrons. New pilots sometimes arrived at combat units with fewer than 100 hours total flight time and minimal gunnery or tactical training. They were lambs sent to slaughter. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, who survived the war and became a commercial pilot, described the situation in a 1983 interview. "I reported to my first squadron in January 1945 with 120 hours of flight time. I had never fired my guns at a towed target. I had never flown in formation with more than 2 other aircraft. I had never practiced a carrier landing because we had no carriers available for training. Within 2 weeks, I was assigned to attack an American task force. I was terrified, not of dying, but of my own incompetence." Abe survived his mission only because American fighters shot down the rest of his flight before reaching him, and he successfully ditched near a Japanese-held island. He never flew combat again. His squadron lost 80% of its pilots in 3 weeks. None achieved a confirmed hit on any American ship. The operational differences between American and Japanese carrier aviation by 1945 were so vast they constituted different forms of warfare. American carriers operated as integrated task forces with multiple carriers, escorts, logistics ships, and air groups functioning as a unified offensive system. They could sustain operations for weeks, projecting power hundreds of miles inland, destroying Japanese facilities almost at will. Japanese carriers, when they could sail at all, operated alone or in pairs, with minimal escorts and limited logistics support. They could rarely sustain operations beyond a single day. Their strikes were often one-way missions, as pilots lacked fuel to return even if they survived American defenses. The Battle of Okinawa, beginning in April 1945, demonstrated American carrier dominance in its most absolute form. Task Force 58, later redesignated Task Force 38, deployed 11 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers with over 1,300 aircraft. These carriers provided continuous air support for the invasion, flying over 41,000 combat sorties between April and June. They maintained combat air patrols over the fleet 24 hours daily. They launched strikes against kamikaze airfields throughout southern Japan. They interdicted Japanese shipping and destroyed aircraft on the ground. Japanese opposition was almost entirely kamikaze attacks by land-based aircraft. No Japanese carriers participated in the battle. No conventional Japanese carrier strikes were launched. The mighty Japanese carrier force that had stunned the world at Pearl Harbor had simply ceased to exist. Some individual moments from Okinawa illustrate the totality of American dominance. On April 16, 1945, USS Intrepid detected a single Japanese reconnaissance aircraft approaching the task force at 200 miles range. Fighter direction officers scrambled 4 Hellcats to intercept. The Hellcats destroyed the reconnaissance plane 140 miles from the task force. The Japanese pilot never saw an American ship and never transmitted a contact report. His mission, his life, ended in empty ocean, his sacrifice meaningless. This pattern repeated hundreds of times. Japanese aircraft launched to attack American ships rarely reached their targets. American radar detected them at extreme ranges. Combat air patrols intercepted them far from the fleet. The few that penetrated to visual range faced withering anti-aircraft fire from dozens of ships. The fewer still that survived to attack found their bombs and torpedoes absorbed by massive armored carriers or struck smaller escorts that American industry could replace in weeks. For every American ship damaged, dozens of Japanese aircraft and their pilots were destroyed. The exchange rate was economically and militarily unsustainable, but Japan continued it because no alternatives existed. The carriers that might have provided an alternative had been sunk or rendered inoperable by lack of fuel, aircraft, and pilots. Former Rear Admiral Toshitane Takata, who served as a staff officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy's Aviation Bureau, addressed this in his 1968 memoir. By 1945, we understood we had lost the carrier war completely. American carriers numbered in the dozens. Ours could be counted on one hand and could not sail. American pilots were skilled professionals. Ours were barely trained boys. American aircraft were sophisticated machines. Ours were increasingly primitive. We had lost not just the battles, but the entire foundation of carrier warfare. Takata's memoir included a particularly striking passage about American Essex-class carriers. We obtained intelligence reports describing Essex carrier operations. The reports claimed a single Essex could launch and recover over 100 sorties daily for sustained periods. Our analysts initially rejected these reports as exaggerations or propaganda. Then we captured an American pilot who confirmed the figures. We asked him how this was possible. He seemed confused by the question, as if continuous high-tempo operations were simply normal. He explained about their hangar systems, their elevators, their fueling arrangements, their maintenance procedures. We realized that American carriers operated on principles fundamentally different from ours. They had industrialized carrier aviation. We were still artisans. This industrialization extended to every aspect of American carrier operations. Maintenance procedures were standardized across the fleet. Spare parts were interchangeable and abundant. Damaged aircraft could be repaired quickly using mass-produced components. Mechanics worked in shifts, enabling 24-hour maintenance cycles. The result was high aircraft availability rates, often above 85%. Japanese maintenance, by contrast, became increasingly improvised as parts shortages worsened. By 1944, Japanese mechanics were cannibalizing damaged aircraft to keep others flying. Availability rates dropped below 50%. Aircraft sat idle, not from battle damage but from lack of spare parts, tools, or trained mechanics. The human dimension of this disparity was profound. American carrier crews worked long hours in dangerous conditions, but they had adequate food, clean water, medical care, and regular mail from home. They knew that if wounded, they would receive excellent medical treatment. If killed, their families would be notified and supported. They fought within a system that valued their lives and tried to protect them. Japanese carrier crews by 1945 often lacked adequate food. Fresh water was sometimes rationed, medical supplies were scarce. Mail service was irregular and heavily censored. They knew that if wounded, medical care might be minimal. If killed, their families might receive only a brief notification. If that, they fought within a system that increasingly viewed them as expendable. This contrast affected morale in obvious ways. American carrier crews were confident, even cocky. They believed in their equipment, their training, and their mission. Japanese carrier crews were increasingly fatalistic. They fought bravely, but with diminishing hope. Lieutenant Kenji Yanagimoto, who served aboard the carrier Zuikaku until her sinking in October 1944, described the mood in a post-war memoir. We knew by mid-1944 that we could not win. We saw the American carriers multiply while ours disappeared. We watched their aircraft improve while ours stayed the same or worsened. We launched strikes knowing most would not return, not in glorious death, but in futile waste. Many of us stopped writing home because we could not bear to lie to our families, and we could not tell them the truth. Yanagimoto survived Zuikaku's sinking and spent the rest of the war at a land base in Japan. He described watching American carrier aircraft strike targets near his base in July 1945. They came every day, sometimes twice daily. Their formations were perfect. Their bombing was accurate. Our anti-aircraft fire was ineffective. We scrambled, fighters, when we had fuel, but American escorts shot them down. After 2 weeks, we stopped trying to intercept. We just watched them destroy our facilities methodically, professionally. It was like watching a machine. There was no hate in it, no passion, just efficiency. That was more terrifying than violence. The final statistics of the carrier war reveal its one-sided conclusion. Japan began the Pacific War with 10 operational fleet and light carriers. Japan commissioned 13 additional carriers during the war, for a total of 23. All were sunk or scrapped. Not one Japanese carrier survived the war in operational condition. The United States began the war with 7 carriers. The United States commissioned 149 additional carriers during the war, for a total of 156. 11 were sunk or scrapped due to damage. 145 survived the war. Many remained in service for decades. Several Essex-class carriers operated into the 1970s, serving in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The loss ratios tell the same story. Japanese carriers sank at rates exceeding 90%. American carriers achieved survival rates exceeding 90%. Even accounting for the different operational doctrines, damage control capabilities, and strategic circumstances, the disparity was overwhelming. But perhaps the most telling statistic is this. In the final year of the war, from August 1944 to August 1945, Japanese carriers launched approximately 1,000 combat sorties total. American carriers launched over 250,000 combat sorties during the same period. The ratio was 250 to 1. A single American carrier task group flew more sorties in 1 month than all Japanese carriers flew in the entire final year of the war. For Japanese pilots who understood these numbers, despair was rational. No amount of courage, skill, or sacrifice could overcome such material disparity. The war had become what one Japanese naval officer called a mathematical certainty of defeat. Yet Japanese pilots continued flying, continued fighting, and continued dying long after the outcome was certain. Some flew from carriers in the war's final months, even though those carriers rarely sortied and their strikes rarely achieved anything. More flew from land bases in increasingly desperate kamikaze attacks, trading their lives for minimal damage to an enemy who barely noticed. The letters they stopped writing home would have told a truth too painful for families to bear and too dangerous for military censors to allow. That truth was simple. American carriers had become so numerous, so capable, and so dominant that Japanese naval aviation had effectively ceased to exist as a meaningful military force. One Essex carrier could deploy more aircraft than Japan had left, and America had dozens of Essex carriers. On August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, the few surviving Japanese carrier pilots listened in silence. Many felt not shame, but relief. The lie they could no longer pretend to believe had finally been acknowledged. They had fought an enemy whose industrial strength made victory impossible. They had watched American carriers multiply while their own disappeared. They had launched knowing they would not return, not in glorious sacrifice, but in mathematical inevitability. Former Lieutenant Commander Kusaka, who survived the war and became a teacher, wrote in his 1970 memoir about that day in October 1944 when he watched the Essex carrier conduct 63 flight operations in 40 minutes. That was the moment I knew we had lost. Not because of that one carrier, but because of what it represented. America had systematized carrier warfare. They had made it industrial, efficient, relentless. We were still fighting with courage and spirit. But spirit cannot defeat steel when the steel never stops coming. The Essex-class carriers that so impressed and terrified Kusaka continued serving long after the war. Many were modernized in the 1950s, receiving angled flight decks, steam catapults, and updated electronics. They served in Korea, Vietnam, and the Cold War. The last Essex to see active service was USS Lexington, which operated as a training carrier until 1991, nearly 50 years after her commissioning. Today, 4 Essex-class carriers survive as museums. USS Yorktown in Charleston, South Carolina, USS Intrepid in New York City, USS Hornet in Alameda, California, USS Lexington in Corpus Christi, Texas. Visitors walking their flight decks can still see the elevators, catapults, and arresting gear that made these ships the dominant naval weapons of their era. Japanese carriers exist only in photographs, documents, and wrecks scattered across the Pacific seafloor. Not one survived to become a museum. Not one lived to show future generations what they represented. They were erased, systematically and completely, by an enemy whose industrial power they never truly understood until too late. The title of this story suggested Japanese pilots stopped writing home after seeing one Essex carrier deploy more planes than Japan had left. This was not metaphor. By late 1944, operational Japanese carrier aviation had declined to approximately 200 aircraft across all remaining carriers. An Essex-class carrier in standard configuration carried 90 to 100 aircraft. But when you include the aircraft in maintenance, in reserve, and available aboard the multiple Essex carriers operating together, a single American task group often had more readily available aircraft than Japan's entire carrier force. For pilots who understood this reality, writing letters home became impossible. What could they say? That they flew against an enemy who owned the sky? That their carriers hid in port while American carriers steamed arrogantly offshore? That every mission was likely their last, not in glorious combat, but in futile gesture? Silence was more honest. And so they stopped writing. They flew when ordered, they fought when they could. And they died knowing the truth they could never tell their families. That the war had been lost before it truly began. Lost to an enemy whose factories and shipyards and training programs could produce carriers and aircraft and pilots faster than Japan could ever hope to destroy them. The Pacific War was decided by many factors: strategy, geography, resources, leadership, and luck. But perhaps no single factor was more decisive than America's carrier dominance. From near parity in 1942 to overwhelming superiority by 1944, American carriers achieved such numerical and qualitative advantages that Japanese naval aviation simply ceased to function as an effective force. One Essex carrier deploying more planes than Japan had left was not propaganda, it was arithmetic. And arithmetic, unlike courage or honor or sacrifice, cannot be defeated by will alone. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.